There's a moment that happens when you realize you've been chasing the wrong thing. Maybe it's sitting in traffic on your way to a job that pays well but hollows you out. Maybe it's scrolling through your phone at 11 p.m. in a city that never stops moving, wondering why you feel so alone in a place with 8 million people. Maybe it's looking at your bank account and realizing you can finally afford the life you wanted 5 years ago, except now you're too tired to want it. Happiness isn't supposed to be this complicated, but somewhere along the way, we bought into a formula. Get the degree, get the job, get the promotion, get the city with the opportunities, get the income that makes it all make sense. And then, if we're lucky, happiness just shows up, except it doesn't. The states where Americans report being genuinely happy, not Instagram happy, not my career is on track happy, but actually content with their lives. Those states broke the formula. Some of them are cold enough to freeze your regrets solid. Some of them have fewer people than a college football stadium. One of them costs so much that affording it feels like a full-time job, and people still call it paradise. These aren't the states you'd expect. These aren't the ones with the best economies, or the biggest cities, or the most opportunities on paper. These are the places that figured out what actually matters and then built everything around that. Consequences be damned. We're counting down the 7 happiest states in America, and if you're tired of being told that the next promotion, the next move, the next achievement will finally be enough, this might be the most important ranking you watch this year. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right and still not happy. Drop a comment with what you think actually creates contentment, because we're about to find out. Let's go! Number 7, Colorado, the obvious choice that actually delivers. We're starting with the state everyone saw coming, because sometimes the obvious answer is obvious for a reason. Colorado ranks 7th in our happiness index, and if your first thought is, well yeah, mountains, you're not wrong, but you're not right either. Colorado's consistent appearance in well-being rankings isn't an accident of geography. It's the result of decades of intentional choices about what kind of state this was going to be, and those choices show up in data that has nothing to do with ski resorts. According to the CDC's most recent well-being survey, Colorado ranks 4th nationally in overall life satisfaction. The state has the 2nd lowest obesity rate in America at 24.9%, and before you chalk that up to altitude making it harder to breathe while eating donuts, consider this. Colorado spends more per capita on parks and recreation than almost any state in the country. Denver alone maintains over 14,000 acres of mountain parks. They didn't just get lucky with scenery, they protected it, funded it, and made access to it a civic priority. But here's where it gets interesting. Colorado also ranks in the top 10 for mental health care access, with 89% of residents living in areas with adequate mental health providers, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. The state legislature has consistently funded behavioral health services even during budget cuts. They connected the dots between outdoor access and mental health, then built the infrastructure to support both. The median household income sits at $77,127, which is 18% above the national average, but the cost of living runs 19% higher than the national median. You're not getting a discount on happiness here. A Denver 1-bedroom averages $1,847 a month, and if you want to live near the trails you're Instagramming, add another $400. The trade-off is explicit. You pay more to live here, and in return, you get a state that takes your well-being seriously enough to budget for it. Education spending tells the same story. Colorado invests $13,952 per student annually, and while that's not top tier, the outcomes are high school graduation rates hit 81.9%, and college enrollment rates consistently outpace the national average. This matters for happiness because education creates economic mobility, and economic mobility creates the breathing room to actually enjoy those mountains everyone moved here for. The culture has a specific vibe that either clicks with you immediately or drives you insane. A local Reddit thread described Boulder as a place where your Uber driver has a PhD and your barista is training for an ultra marathon. That's not an exaggeration. The performative wellness can be exhausting. Yes, everyone hikes before work. Yes, the dog has a better outdoor gear collection than you do. And yes, the Subaru Outback is basically the state bird at this point. Picture this: 6 a.m. in Boulder. The Flatirons are turning pink with sunrise. You're on a trail before work, passing people who are also on trails before work, and nobody finds this unusual. Later, you'll pay $7 for a green juice juice made by someone who summited 314ers this weekend. Your modest house costs $650,000. Your coffee runs $6, but you're surrounded by people who decided that access to this, the trails, the light, the casual assumption that outdoor time is non-negotiable, was worth restructuring their entire budget around. One local told us, "I took a pay cut to move here, and I've never regretted it. In Texas, I made more money and owned a bigger house, but I was miserable. Here I'm broke and outside, and somehow that math works." Colorado proves that happiness can be purchased, but not the way we think. You're not buying the mountains. You're buying proximity to a culture that prioritized well-being over growth, funded the systems that support mental and physical health, and then protected the natural assets that make it all work. The state isn't happy because of the geography. It's happy because it treated the geography like infrastructure worth maintaining. But if Colorado is what happens when a state leans into its obvious advantages, what happens when a state has no obvious advantages and builds happiness anyway? 6. Minnesota, the cold comfort paradox. From the Rockies, we head to a place where the landscape is actively hostile to human comfort 6 months a year, and yet people are thriving in ways that make no meteorological sense. Minnesota ranks 6th, and this is where the just move somewhere pretty theory of happiness starts falling apart. January temperatures in Minneapolis average 13 degrees. That's the high. The low average is -3, and wind chill regularly pushes it to -30. Residents experience an average of 156 days below freezing annually. By every measure of climate-based quality of life, Minnesota should be a dystopia where people huddle indoors and dream of Florida. Instead, it consistently ranks in the top 5 states for well-being, life satisfaction, and mental health outcomes. So what's happening here? Minnesota has the 3rd lowest poverty rate in America at 9.3% according to Census Bureau data, but that statistic hides the more interesting story. The state's Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, is among the lowest in the nation at 0.447. Translation: Minnesota doesn't just have low poverty, it has low inequality, which means the gap between struggling and comfortable is smaller than almost anywhere else in America. When your neighbor isn't that much richer or poorer than you are, it turns out everyone breathes a little easier. The state's social safety net isn't theoretical. Minnesota provides state-funded health care to families earning up to 200% of the federal poverty line. Child care assistance covers families earning up to $68,163 annually for a family of 3. These aren't just programs on paper. 93% of Minnesota children have health insurance, the second highest rate in the country. Parents aren't choosing between rent and doctor visits, which means they're not passing financial anxiety down to their kids. Education funding runs deep and deliberate. Minnesota spends $14,417 per student, but the real story is early childhood education. The state funds pre-K programs that serve 22% of 4-year-olds with income-based sliding scales that make it accessible across economic brackets. They're investing in well-being before kids can spell the word. Civic engagement levels border on obsessive. Minnesota voter turnout in 2024 hit 76.3%, the highest in the nation. Residents volunteer at rates 40% above the national average. This isn't just feel-good community service. Research from Harvard's Human Flourishing program shows that civic engagement is one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction, even controlling for income and health. Minnesotans aren't happy despite the cold. They're happy because they built systems that create communal resilience, and then they participate in those systems. Colorado funded outdoor infrastructure. Minnesota funded social infrastructure. Both strategies work, and both cost money that residents decided was worth spending. Minneapolis-St. Paul maintains 197 miles of bike trails that are plowed and salted in winter. Let that sink in. They don't just build recreation infrastructure and shut it down when it snows. They maintain it year-round because they've decided that outdoor access and physical activity aren't seasonal luxuries. They're necessities worth funding even when it's -10 outside. The median home price sits at $374,900, which is 12% below the national median. A Minneapolis one-bedroom rents for $1,423. You're not getting California beaches or Colorado mountains, but you're getting a state that redistributes wealth through functioning systems rather than letting inequality compound until half the population can't afford therapy. Picture this. February in St. Paul, it's 8 degrees and snowing sideways. You're cross-country skiing on a groomed trail in a city park, passing families doing the same. Later, you'll hit a community sauna, because yes, Minnesota has community saunas. Your cost of living is manageable, your kids' pre-K is covered, and when you get sick, you won't lose your house. The trade-off is brutal winters. The payoff is a society that actually functions. A Reddit thread summed it up perfectly. I've lived in San Diego and Minneapolis. San Diego has better weather. Minnesota has better humans. Minnesota isn't happy because of what it has. It's happy because of what it built. A social infrastructure that catches people before they fall, funded by a population that actually believes in collective investment. The cold doesn't matter when you're surrounded by systems designed to help you survive it. But if Minnesota proves you don't need good weather for happiness, our next state proves you don't even need diversity of thought. Number 5, Utah, the unexpected social capital champion. We're heading to a state that shouldn't work according to conventional wisdom about pluralism and happiness, and yet it's one of the most content places in America. Utah ranks 5th, and this is the entry that's going to make people uncomfortable because Utah's happiness metrics challenge every assumption about what creates well-being in a modern, diverse society. 63% of Utah residents identify as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, according to Pew Research. That kind of religious homogeneity typically raises red flags about exclusion, insularity, and limited social mobility for people outside the dominant culture. But here's what the data actually shows. Utah has the lowest loneliness rates in America, the highest volunteering rates, and social trust levels that make the rest of the country look like a failed state experiment. The volunteering statistic is staggering. 51% of Utah adults volunteer regularly, nearly double the national average of 28%. This isn't just church service. It's community meals, disaster relief, youth mentoring, and elder care. The infrastructure of mutual aid is so embedded that it functions like a parallel social safety net. When Harvard researchers studied Utah's social capital, they found that residents have an average of 40% more close social connections than the national average. People know their neighbors, they ask for help, they offer help. The reciprocity is assumed, not exceptional. If Minnesota built happiness through government programs, Utah built it through cultural infrastructure that predates any state policy. Both models work, they just look nothing alike. Mental health outcomes back this up. Utah's rate of frequent mental distress sits at 11.2%, lower than the national average of 13.8% according to CDC data. Yes, Utah also has higher rates of antidepressant use, which critics love to cite as evidence of hidden misery. But when you control for the fact that Utah residents are more likely to seek treatment and have better access to mental health care, the pattern flips. They're not more depressed, they're more willing to address depression, which is actually a sign of functional community support. The state ranks 3rd nationally in economic mobility. A child born in the bottom income quintile has a 10.8% chance of reaching the top quintile compared to 7.5% nationally. That's not happening by accident. Utah invests $8,105 per student in education, lower than many states, but graduation rates hit 87%, 4th in the nation. They're getting better outcomes with less money, which suggests the social infrastructure is doing work that other states are trying to purchase with bigger budgets. Median household income is $75,780, and the median home price is $500,800. That's not cheap, but relative to income, it's more manageable than most Western states. A Salt Lake City one-bedroom rents for $1,384. You're paying for access to outdoor recreation that rivals Colorado. 5 national parks, world-class skiing, desert, and mountain landscapes within an hour of the capital, but you're also paying for something less tangible, the assumption that your community will show up when you need it. Here's the part that makes outsiders nervous, that community support is often filtered through religious infrastructure. If you're not LDS, the experience is different. Non-Mormon residents report feeling like cultural outsiders, and the political homogeneity can be stifling. Utah votes Republican by 20+ point margins, and if you're looking for ideological diversity, you won't find it here. The trade-off is explicit. You get incredible social cohesion and mutual support, but you're joining a culture with strong norms and expectations. Fun fact, Utah has more ice cream consumption per capita than any state in America. The running theory is that when you don't drink alcohol, you compensate with dessert. The state supports 1.5 ice cream shops per 10,000 residents. That's not relevant to happiness metrics, but it is deeply revealing about a culture that finds different outlets for joy. Picture this: Sunday afternoon in Provo. The streets are quiet because half the town is at church. You're hiking Bridal Veil Falls with families who started their day at 6 a.m. services and will end it at a potluck where someone's already asked if you need help moving next weekend. You didn't ask for help, they just assumed. Your mortgage is manageable, your kid's school is excellent, and you have more close friendships than you did in the city you left. The trade-off is cultural conformity. The payoff is never being alone. One transplant told us off the record, "I'm not religious and I'll never fully fit in here, but my neighbors brought meals when I had surgery, watched my kids without being asked, and helped me move twice. I've lived in 6 states. This is the only place where people actually do that." Utah proves that happiness doesn't require diversity of thought. It requires density of connection. The state built social capital so thick that it functions like infrastructure, and residents are content in ways that individualistic, pluralistic societies struggle to replicate. You can question whether that model scales or even whether it's desirable, but you can't question the outcomes. People here are measurably less lonely and more satisfied with their lives than almost anywhere else in America. But if Utah found happiness through religious cohesion, our next state found it by rejecting everything modern America says you need to thrive. Point for 4. Vermont, the intentional downshift. From the Wasatch Range, we're heading to a state that looked at the American growth model and said, "No thanks, we're good." Vermont ranks 4th with a population of 647,000, smaller than most major cities, and a conscious decision to stay that way. This is the state that rejected Walmart, not figuratively, literally. Vermont towns have voted down Walmart developments repeatedly through local zoning laws, preferring to keep downtown general stores that close at 6 p.m. and charge more for everything. Act 250, passed in 1970, gives residents the power to block development that would unduly burden local character. They've used it to stop strip malls, big box stores, and suburban sprawl. The trade-off is economic efficiency. The payoff is that Vermont still looks like Vermont, and here's the kicker. Vermont is also the only state in America without a single billboard. None. Zero. The state banned them in 1968, and residents have fought to keep them banned ever since. You can drive from one end of the state to the other without seeing a single advertisement screaming at you to buy something you don't need. That might sound trivial, but try explaining to someone from Times Square what it feels like to drive through a landscape that isn't trying to sell you anything. The median household income is $63,477, which is 12% below the national average. The median home price is $379,000, which feels high until you realize that includes extremely rural properties where your nearest neighbor is a quarter mile away. A Burlington one-bedroom rents for $1,528, which is steep for a small city, but you're paying for access to a way of life that doesn't exist in most of America anymore. What you're getting for that price is a state that takes localism seriously enough to structure policy around it. Vermont has more farmers markets per capita than any state in America, one for every 6,200 residents. 62% of the state's food establishments source from local farms, and farm to table isn't a restaurant marketing gimmick. It's economic infrastructure. The state actively funds small-scale agriculture, local food systems, and land conservation to maintain working landscapes. This creates well-being in ways that are hard to measure but impossible to miss. According to Gallup polling, Vermont consistently ranks top 5 nationally in community pride and attachment. 89% of residents say their community is improving or staying the same, compared to 67% nationally. That's not blind optimism. It's contentment with stasis, which in modern America is almost radical. If Colorado paid for happiness with higher costs of living, Vermont paid for it by saying no to economic growth that would have made everyone richer and more miserable. Education spending runs $19,340 per student, the second highest in the nation. For a state with below average income, that's a statement of priorities. Class sizes average 11 students. Teacher pay averages $65,000, which is middle of the pack nationally, but generous relative to Vermont's cost of living. The state isn't trying to create Harvard feeders. It's trying to create residents who want to stay, and the retention rates suggest it's working. 65% of Vermont high school graduates who attend college return to the state within 10 years. Town meeting day is a state holiday. Let that sink in. Vermont shuts down every March so residents can gather in person to debate local budgets, zoning changes, and school funding. Voter turnout for these meetings averages 20%, which sounds low until you realize that's 20% of the entire town showing up to argue about snowplow routes and library hours. This is democracy at a scale where your vote actually matters and your voice is actually heard. Mental health outcomes reflect this localism. Vermont has the second highest rate of mental health care access in America, with 95% of residents living in areas with adequate providers. The state funds community mental health centers in every county, with sliding scale fees based on income. Suicide rates are higher than the national average, 17.9 per 100,000 compared to 14.2 nationally, which speaks to rural isolation and access to firearms, but it also speaks to a state that tracks and reports mental health crises honestly instead of hiding them. Picture this. October in Montpelier. The Capitol building, the smallest state capitol in America, sits surrounded by trees exploding into color. You're at a farmer's market buying vegetables from someone you know by name. Later, you'll attend a town select board meeting about whether to approve a new housing development, and your opinion will actually matter because there are only 8,000 people in town. Your income is lower than it was in Boston. Your career prospects are limited, and Amazon takes 3 days to deliver. The trade-off is economic dynamism. The payoff is that your life is scaled to human proportions. A local wrote in a community forum, "I left Vermont for New York for the opportunities. I came back for the life. I make less money and own a smaller house, but I'm outside every day. I know my neighbors, and I sleep through the night. That trade-off isn't even close." Vermont proves that happiness doesn't require growth. It requires intention. The state looked at what makes people content: connection to place, participation in community, access to nature, economic self-determination, and then protected those things even when it meant sacrificing efficiency, scale, and wealth accumulation. Most of America thinks Vermont is quaint. Vermont thinks most of America is insane. And if Vermont rejected the growth model on principle, our next state is testing whether you can have both. Number 3. Idaho, the newcomer invasion success story. We're heading to the state that's been declared ruined by transplants approximately 40,000 times on Reddit, and yet somehow keeps getting happier. Idaho ranks 3rd, and this shouldn't be possible. Between 2010 and 2024, Idaho's population grew by 27%, the second fastest growth rate in America. Boise's population alone increased by 23% in the last decade. For context, that kind of growth typically destroys quality of life. Infrastructure lags, housing prices explode, locals get priced out, traffic becomes unbearable, and community cohesion collapses under the weight of too many strangers arriving too fast. Vermont actively prevents this. Utah never had to deal with it. Colorado absorbed it decades ago and paid the price. Idaho is experiencing it in real time, and somehow the happiness metrics are holding. According to the most recent Gallup National Health and Wellbeing Index, Idaho ranks 3rd in overall life satisfaction, up from 7th in 2015. Residents report higher levels of physical health, emotional health, and sense of purpose than they did before the migration wave. That's not supposed to happen. Growth usually trades quality of life for economic expansion. Idaho is somehow threading the needle. So what's different here? First, the growth hasn't completely destroyed affordability. Yet, the median home price in Boise hit $540,000, which locals will tell you is apocalyptic compared to the $280,000 it was in 2015. But that same house costs $950,000 in Denver, $1.1 million in Portland, and $1.4 million in Seattle. A Boise one-bedroom rents for $1,395. Locals are absolutely getting priced out of desirable neighborhoods, and the resentment is real and justified. But relative to peer cities seeing similar growth, Idaho has maintained a livability threshold that matters. You can still participate in the lifestyle that drew people here, which is more than you can say for Austin, Nashville, or Phoenix. Second, Idaho protected the outdoor access that makes the lifestyle work. The state maintains over 30 state parks and manages 1.2 million acres of state lands open to recreation. Boise alone has 190 miles of greenbelt and trail systems, and the city has continued expanding that network even as population surges. They understood the basic math that Colorado figured out decades ago. If outdoor recreation is the primary amenity drawing migrants, it needs to scale with the migration. You can't can't sell mountain town vibes and then pave the mountains. Third, the economy is diversifying in ways that create stability. Median household income in Idaho is $60,999, which is 9% below the national average. But the cost of living outside of housing runs 8% below the national average. Micron Technology's semiconductor expansion in ScienceNZ, Boise is projected to create 17,000 jobs over the next decade. Amazon, Meta, and Albertsons have regional operations here. The state is adding white-collar employment without becoming a full-scale tech hub that would crater affordability entirely. Education spending sits at $9,046 per student, which is embarrassingly low, but graduation rates hit 82% and per-student outcomes punch above funding levels. The state university system is affordable. Boise state tuition runs $8,068 for in-state students, and 74% of graduates stay in Idaho, which means the state is retaining educated workers rather than training them for Seattle and San Francisco. Here's where it gets interesting. The culture war between locals and transplants is performance art at this point. Drive through Boise, and you'll see lifted F-250s with "Don't California My Idaho" bumper stickers parked next to Priuses with ski racks. The tension is real, but it's also stabilizing into something functional. Longtime residents have economic opportunities they didn't have before. Transplants have affordability they couldn't find where they came from. Nobody's happy about the compromise, but everyone's participating in it. Fun fact, Idaho has more whitewater rafting rivers than any state except Alaska, and Raft Guide has become one of the fastest growing side hustles in the state. Locals figured out they could monetize transplants' desperation for authentic outdoor experiences, while also maintaining access to rivers that used to be free. It's capitalism and resentment in perfect equilibrium. Mental health outcomes support the idea that this growth isn't breaking the state yet. Idaho ranks 12th nationally in mental health care access, which is respectable for a rural state, and suicide rates have declined from 23.5 per 100,000 in 2015 to 20.8 in 2023. That's still elevated, but it's moving in the right direction during a period of massive demographic disruption, which suggests the social fabric is bending but not breaking. Picture this: Saturday morning in Boise. You're on the greenbelt dodging joggers, cyclists, and people walking dogs that cost more than your first car. The foothills are 15 minutes away, Sun Valley is 3 hours north, and Craters of the Moon is 2 hours south. You bought a house for $480,000 that would cost $1.2 million in Seattle, and your tech job lets you work remote 3 days a week. Yes, your favorite brewery is now full of people who moved here 6 months ago and won't shut up about how authentic it is. Yes, traffic exists now. The trade-off is change. The payoff is that the change hasn't destroyed the thing you came for yet. A local told us, "Do I wish it was still 2010 every single day, but I also like having fiber internet and restaurants that aren't Applebee's. Growth sucks, but economic stagnation sucks worse." We're trying to thread a needle here, and honestly, it's kind of working. Idaho is the live experiment in whether happiness can survive rapid growth. Most places fail this test catastrophically. They either stagnate into poverty or boom into unaffordability. Idaho is somehow pulling off managed chaos, where the growth hurts but doesn't destroy, where the newcomers integrate but don't dominate, where the old and new versions of the state exist in uncomfortable but functional tension. It won't last forever. At some point, the math stops working and Idaho becomes the next Colorado. Still beautiful, still functional, but priced beyond reach for anyone who didn't get in early. But for now, Idaho is proving that the window between affordable and ruined can stay open longer than most people think, as long as you protect the fundamentals. But if Idaho is desperately trying to manage growth without collapsing, our next state achieved happiness by making sure growth never showed up in the first place. Number 2, South Dakota, the forgotten heartland, wins. From the Boise foothills, we're heading to a state that's so far off the national radar that its entire happiness strategy seems to be stay quiet and don't screw it up. South Dakota ranks second, and if your first reaction is, "Wait, seriously?" then congratulations, you're part of why it works. Population, 909,824. That's smaller than San Francisco. The entire state has fewer people than most American cities, and nobody's moving here to change that. Idaho grew 27% and is struggling to manage it. Vermont rejected growth entirely. South Dakota split the difference. Modest growth that nobody outside the state even noticed. Between 2010 and 2024, South Dakota's population grew by just 8.9%, almost entirely from natural increase and modest domestic migration from neighboring states. There's no California Exodus stampede, no remote workers discovering it on TikTok, no tech companies building campuses. South Dakota is functionally invisible to the national migration conversation, and that invisibility is a feature, not a bug, because here's what happens when nobody's paying attention. You can build a functional society. South Dakota has no state income tax. The median household income is $63,920, which is 6% below the national average, but take-home pay after taxes runs higher than in most states. The cost of living sits 11% below the national average. Median home price, $286,500. A Sioux Falls one-bedroom rents for $937. You're not just saving money here, you're saving so much money that financial stress, one of the primary drivers of unhappiness in America, becomes almost optional. The unemployment rate is 2.1%, effectively full employment. South Dakota has more jobs than people to fill them, which creates wage pressure in workers' favor and eliminates the anxiety of job insecurity. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 94% of South Dakota residents who want full-time work have it, compared to 88% nationally. This matters for happiness because employment isn't just income, it's identity, purpose, and structure. Mental health outcomes are exceptional. South Dakota ranks second nationally in mental health care access, with 97% of residents living in areas with adequate mental health providers. The state funds community mental health centers with sliding scale fees, and Medicaid expansion covers adults earning up to 138% of the federal poverty line. Suicide rates sit at 19.6 per 100,000, which is elevated but declining, and rural isolation accounts for most of the variance. For a state this rural and this cold, the mental health infrastructure is quietly impressive. Education spending is $11,353 per student, which is below average, but high school graduation rates hit 84% and college enrollment rates track with the national average. The state isn't trying to create Ivy League pipelines, it's trying to create residents with skills to participate in the local economy, and the outcomes match the intent. The University of South Dakota charges $9,243 for in-state tuition. You can get a degree without crushing debt, which means young people aren't starting their adult lives underwater. Here's the thing nobody talks about. South Dakota's happiness is the happiness of being ignored by national dysfunction. The state doesn't have enough population to matter in presidential politics, so it doesn't get carpet bombed with culture war messaging. It doesn't have a tech industry, so it doesn't have the boom-bust cycles that destabilize communities. It doesn't have major league sports teams, so it doesn't have billionaires demanding taxpayer-funded stadiums. South Dakota just exists. It funds schools, maintains roads, keeps unemployment low, and doesn't make headlines. Civic engagement is solid but not exceptional. Voter turnout in 2024 hit 68%, which is respectable. Volunteering rates sit at 34%, above the national average. Community trust levels are high, which makes sense in a state where everyone's connected by 2 degrees of separation. You can't afford to screw your neighbor in a place this small, which creates informal accountability that functions better than most regulation. Picture this, November in Sioux Falls. It's 28 degrees and the wind is brutal, but you're not worried about making rent or losing your job. You bought a 3-bedroom house for $270,000 on a salary that would barely cover a studio apartment in Austin. Your kid's school is fine, your healthcare is accessible, and your biggest complaint is that there's nothing to do on weekends. The trade-off is cultural irrelevance. The payoff is economic security and the mental peace that comes from not living on the edge. A transplant from Chicago summed it up. I moved here thinking it would be temporary. That was 7 years ago. I make less money, but I own a house. I'm never stuck in traffic, and I don't go to bed anxious about layoffs. I didn't realize how much stress I was carrying until I didn't have to carry it anymore. South Dakota proves that happiness doesn't require excitement, diversity, or cultural capital. It requires basics done well: affordable housing, available jobs, accessible healthcare, and the absence of manufactured chaos. The state isn't trying to be interesting, it's trying to be livable. And for the people who live there, that trade-off is working better than almost anywhere else in America. But if South Dakota found happiness by staying small and invisible, our #1 state found it by charging admission so steep that only the committed can afford entry. Number 1. Hawaii, the price of paradise paid in full. We've arrived at the happiest state in America, and it costs more than almost anywhere else to live here. Hawaii ranks first, and this is the ultimate paradox of happiness in modern America. The median home price in Hawaii is $854,000, 119% above the national average. The cost of living runs 88% higher than the mainland. A gallon of milk costs $6.73. Gas averages $4.89. A modest 2-bedroom rental in Honolulu runs $2,850 a month, and that's not beachfront. That's just functional housing in a market where supply is choked by geography, regulation, and the basic physics of being 2,500 miles from the nearest continent. Colorado charges a premium for mountain access. Vermont charges a premium for intentional living. Hawaii charges a premium that makes both of them look like clearance sales, and people still consider it worth it. By every economic measure, Hawaii should be producing miserable residents crushed by financial stress. Housing cost burden. The percentage of income going to housing averages 42% for renters, well above the 30% threshold where economists say financial stress becomes acute. Locals are getting priced out by mainlanders and international buyers. The native Hawaiian population has declined from 60% in 1960 to 21% today, largely due to cost of living displacement. And yet, according to Gallup's National Health and Well-Being Index, the most comprehensive measure of life satisfaction in America, Hawaii has ranked first or second every year for the past decade. So what's happening here? First, the natural environment isn't just beautiful, it's therapeutic. Hawaii has 365 days of outdoor access. You don't need a gym membership because the state is a gym. Ocean swimming, hiking, surfing, and trail running are free and accessible year-round. According to public health research from the University of Hawaii, residents average 45 more minutes of outdoor activity per day than mainland Americans, and that translates directly into better mental health outcomes, lower rates of depression, and higher self-reported happiness. Second, the culture emphasizes community cohesion in ways that mainland individualism has abandoned. The concept of ohana, extended family, isn't just a tourism slogan, it's functional social infrastructure. Multi-generational households are common, not out of poverty, but out of cultural preference. According to census data, 22% of Hawaii households include 3 or more generations compared to 4% nationally. That creates built-in childcare, elder care, and emotional support systems that reduce isolation and financial burden. Third, the pace of life is structurally different. Island time isn't laziness. It's a cultural rejection of mainland productivity obsession. Businesses close early. Traffic moves slowly. Nobody's optimizing their schedule to fit in 7 meetings and a side hustle. According to time use surveys, Hawaii residents spend 23% more time on leisure and social activities than the national average, and that time is strongly correlated with life satisfaction. Mental health outcomes reflect this. Hawaii has the lowest rate of frequent mental distress in America at 9.8%. Compared to the national average of 13.8%. The suicide rate is 14.1 per 100,000 below the national average. Antidepressant use is lower than in most states. By clinical measures of mental health, Hawaii is the most stable state in America. But here's the uncomfortable part. This happiness is increasingly reserved for people who can afford it. The median household income in Hawaii is $88,005, which is 27% above the national average, but that barely covers the cost of living. Local families are leaving. Between 2010 and 2020, Hawaii lost 23,000 residents to outmigration, primarily to Nevada, Arizona, and Washington. The people who remain are either wealthy enough to absorb the costs, rooted enough to accept financial strain, or born into generational land ownership that shields them from market prices. A teacher in Honolulu earns a median salary of $67,000 and spends $2,400 a month on rent. That's 43% of gross income going to housing, which is financially unsustainable, and yet teachers stay because the alternative, leaving the islands, means abandoning culture, family, and a way of life that can't be replicated anywhere else. Picture this: dawn at Lanikai Beach. The water is turquoise and 78 degrees. You paddleboard out past the reef, surrounded by sea turtles, and the kind of morning light that makes you understand why people bankrupt themselves to live here. Later, you'll work a job that pays less than it would on the mainland, in a home that costs twice as much, and you'll consider it a fair trade because this, the ocean, the culture, the slower pace, the community that actually knows your name, this is what you decided life was actually for. A mainland transplant who moved to Maui in 2019 told us, "I make $40,000 less than I did in San Francisco, and my rent is higher. On paper, I'm worse off, but I'm outside every single day. I'm part of a community, and I've stopped feeling like I'm racing towards something I'll never reach. I can't afford to save much, but I'm not sure that was ever the point." Hawaii proves that happiness can be bought, but only if you're willing to pay with everything you have and redefine what wealth actually means. The state isn't happy because it's easy to live here. It's happy because the difficulty filters for people who've decided that natural beauty, cultural richness, and community cohesion are worth more than financial security. And that brings us back to where we started, sitting in traffic in a city that pays well but hollows you out, wondering if you're chasing the wrong thing. 7 states, 7 completely different models of happiness. Colorado bought it with intention and funding. Minnesota built it through social infrastructure. Utah achieved it through religious cohesion. Vermont protected it by rejecting growth. Idaho is testing whether it can survive growth. South Dakota stumbled into it by staying invisible. And Hawaii charges more for it than almost anywhere else in America. None of them followed the formula we've been sold. The one where you maximize income, climb the ladder, and happiness shows up as a reward for achievement. These states ignored that script entirely. Some of them are cold, some of them are isolated. One of them costs so much that affording it becomes a second job. But the people who live there report being genuinely content in ways that wealthier, more dynamic, more successful states can't seem to replicate. The pattern is clear. Happiness in America isn't about having more. It's about knowing what you're optimizing for and building everything around that, even when the trade-offs look insane to everyone else. Maybe it's outdoor access and mental health infrastructure. Maybe it's social safety nets that catch you before you fall. Maybe it's community density that eliminates loneliness. Maybe it's rejecting the whole growth model and staying small on purpose. Maybe it's full employment and low taxes. Maybe it's paying a fortune to live somewhere beautiful and deciding that's a reasonable exchange. The states that got happiness right didn't do it by accident. They made choices, often decades ago, about what kind of places they wanted to be. And the people who live there now are experiencing the compounding returns of those choices. If this shifted how you think about what actually creates a good life, hit that like button. If you've lived in any of these states, drop a comment with whether the data matches your experience. Subscribe if you want more videos that challenge the conventional wisdom about success, wealth, and what we're actually chasing. Where you live matters. What you optimize for matters more.